All right. Well, I'm going to talk about a breakthrough that seemed impossible. You know, that's the classic. You're like really excited. You have an idea. It's going to change the world. We're going to do this great stuff. And then you start finding out the problems and that it's impossible. But you got to stick with it, okay? You know what kind of tea is hard to swallow? Reality, okay? And that's what, so we're going to jump back to the 1950s, and you know, computers were kind of the new cool thing. Now, we've learned about how with the computers, they speak in binary or they communicate in binary, and so you have those vacuum tubes in those old computers, basically an on-off, and each one they added, they got more and more power, and then we went from vacuum tubes to transistors, which thank goodness, because then that shrunk the size of each of those pieces, so we could have more easily and less power. Well, then computers got hungrier. They were like, give me more, give me, I don't know why computers sound like Arnold Schwarzenegger, give me more, no. And it got crazy again, too many transistors. And it got to the point where they call it the tyranny of numbers, because we can't make computers faster because it's going to take too many computer parts. It's getting crazy. And it got to the point where you'd have boards, circuit boards, of just all these different transistors, and you'd put different circuit boards in, and it was just growing crazy. And then we started getting into integrated circuits where you could have a few transistors in one chip, and that helped. But even that, they wanted faster computers. Well, that's kind of where we get to in the late 1960s, where we're going to talk about this scientist engineer. So we're going to talk about Federico Faggin. And he was from Italy. He was actually working in Italy. And when Faggin was in Italy, he did an engineer swap. It was going to be a 6-month engineer swap where he got to trade and go to the United States for 6 months. He just got married. He was like, bye, honey, I'll be back in 6 months. Well, while he was in the States, the work that he did was incredible, so incredible. And his work was on things like semiconductors and things like with silicon. Hint, he went to Silicon Valley. And he eventually told his wife, guess what? I need to stay here. Like, the stuff I'm doing is so important. So they ended up moving to the United States. And so he started working. And eventually he would get a job at a fairly new company called Intel. And one of the things at Intel was they were working on different things like memory and computers and such. Well, they got a contract, an order from a Japanese company. And the Japanese company wanted some special chips. Now, Federico was a specialist in something called silicon gate and MOS technology. And I'm not going to get too deep into that, but that was a specialty that he actually made several breakthroughs in. And that was one of the reasons they really wanted him on the team. Well, the Japanese company called Busicom wanted a calculator. And it was a special new calculator, and for the calculator to be able to do what they wanted it to, it would need several different kinds of chips designed. And that was kind of how it worked at the time, was depending on what computer functions you needed, you would get custom designed chips for the different functions or tasks or kinds of tasks. So Federico and some of the team were tasked with designing these multiple chips, computer chips, that would go in this new calculator. And they had this idea, and it was, what if we could simplify some of the base design and combine several chips into one? What if we made one chip that was so powerful and so well and efficiently designed that it could handle different functions? So instead of designing chips for different functions, design one chip that could do different functions. And that was a revolutionary idea. And they actually started working on that, him and two other gentlemen, Ted Hoff and Stanley Mazer. And this team started working on this idea. Now, this was like pretty, extreme. Like, there were some companies that all they would do was they would make custom chips. In fact, one of the CEOs of a different company heard about this idea, and he made the statement, anybody who thinks that is a good idea is crazy. And Federico heard about that, so he had the quote framed and hung it in his office, okay? Well, they were working on this, and it seemed pretty promising. I mean, it sounds like a good idea. Yeah, one chip, it can do all this stuff, but to actually design it. So this chip would have a lot more power. It would have, instead of a few transistors, many transistors, and would be able to do a ton of stuff. Well, Federico was the main one designing the actual silicon and the runs and the circuitry inside of this silicon. And here's, let me show you a little schematic of some of his designs inside, that would be inside of this chip. And the stuff that they did in here basically would allow them to have this kind of power. Well, the problem was, to really test it, they had to process this to the point where it could be tested. So he didn't know if what he was doing would work until they got it to a testable point. So here's a testable layout where they actually made test versions of this chip. And one little fun note is, if you used a microscope and you looked really close on this, you would see his initials FF in the bottom corner on every chip that he designed. Well, they would do a test, and then they'd run into all this debugging issues. They'd do another test and then find more issues. And his wife said that they were ready to do the next batch. It was looking like maybe this is it. And she said she went home, and she knew that he was going to run the test that night. So she was waiting at home like, oh, please work. And he was alone at the lab getting ready to run the test of this new system they had processed. And she said she eventually went to bed because he still hadn't come home. And then she heard him arrive at the house. So she got up and she went and asked him. And he said it worked. And she said they were ecstatic because it finally worked. And this piece that they made would become the 4004 microprocessor. And it was basically all of the computer in one chip, you could say, like the brain of the computer in this chip. Now, it was pretty rudimentary, and they would, get this calculator made, but then he would go on, and they would make another version, the 8008. And, if you look at this 4004, it has 16 pins. The 808 had 18 pins, and then he wanted to do the next step. And so he realized one of the limitations was those pins. The pins, this chip could do so much that the functions were taking turns on the pins. So many functions could go, but they had to wait for a turn on the pin. So he told his management, we need to make a new chip with more pins so that there's more pathways. And they're like, that's going to be more expensive. I don't know. And it took him 9 months to convince management to let him make this chip. And this is the 8080. And you could say this is kind of the first real microprocessor. And this had 40 pins. And this thing could go really... So the first one, that 4004, it had over 2,000 transistors in it. And the 8080 had over 8,000 transistors inside of it, which is incredible. Well, after this chip, he ended up leaving Intel, and he started a company called Zilog. And here he is in one of the promo photos at Zilog. We've got this cool tiger going here. And at that company, he worked on his own chip called the Z80. And that Z80 was even more powerful. And it was an incredibly designed chip. Now, in the early days of releasing this, he met another scientist engineer who happened to be working on a computer that needed a chip. So he went to meet with the engineer, and here he is, named Roger Billings, and they started looking at how to incorporate the chip into the Billings computer system. And it was so early on that they actually had to go back and forth on, he'd give Roger Billings a prototype, and he'd test it and then give results back. And again, just like before, they had to process it to the point that it could be tested. It went back and forth. And finally, the Billings computer was released with the Z80 microprocessor inside of it. And this is really, that chip held this new era of all of a sudden that vision of you can have a personal computer. And the Billings computer all of a sudden was this personal computer that people could have instead of, I need 2 large rooms and a ton of power and a team to run. It's like, this is a personal computer. And all these computer parts shrunk down into this tiny chip. So if it gets hard and the people start saying you can't do it, maybe just start hanging up the quotes and stick with it, and you never know what you'll finish. Thank you.